morning, everyone. My name is Yulia Chekunaeva, and I'm director of the newly established Clean Growth Leadership Network. I'm delighted to be joined on this International Day of Peace by Steve Killelea, the founder and chairman of the Institute for Economics and Peace and founding fellow of the CGLN network, who is joining me from Sydney this morning. Morning, Steve.
How are you, Yulia?
Awesome, thank you. So, Steve, you had quite a career. Can you tell me, as an introduction, how did an IT entrepreneur such as yourself come to delve into the crucial yet largely misunderstood concept of global peace and establish the world only quantitative measure of peace, the Global Peace Index? Why measuring peace?
Well, so I actually got there accidentally. So if we go back, my background's in computing, started off as a computer programmer. I was quite a shy, retiring sort of guy in those days, unlike I am now. And so I established two programs, then launched two companies off, and one ended up publicly listed on NASDAQ, the other on the Australian Stock Exchange. So I made a lot of money out of them, established a family foundation to work with the poorest of the poor. And so that took us to work outside Australia, a lot of time in Africa, a lot of time in Northeast Asia like Burma, Laos, Cambodia, East Timor, Papua New Guinea, places like that. And I was in Northeast Kivu in the Congo looking at a project there dealing with fistula tears for women. And it's one of the more violent places in the world. And I started to think, well, what is the opposite of all these stressed out countries I'm spending time in? What are the most peaceful nations of the world? That was sort of a fantasy question. And I just thought maybe there's something from that I can bring into the projects we're doing. So I got back to Sydney, searched the internet and couldn't find anything. And that's how the Global Peace Index was born. But that poses really, really basic question. What are the most peaceful nations in the world? And it hasn't been done. Then how much do we know about peace? If you can't measure something, can you truly understand it? If you can't measure it, how do you know whether your actions are helping you or hindering you in achieving your goals? You simply don't.
Something that comes out by accident is truly, impressive and impactful. I think, it's going to be great to discuss your book, Peace in the Age of the Chaos. So you note there that we have an obligation to pass on a more peaceful world to the next generation. This is not just because they deserve the chance to reach their full potential, but also because unless we can improve our cooperation and collaboration, they will not be able to survive the challenges of the environmental change. Resources exhaustion, the threat posed by nuclear annihilation, or another more deadly pandemic. Can you expand on the understanding or definitions of peace you use in the Institute for Economics and Peace, and maybe dwell a little bit into how current generations can help future generations?
So we look at the major challenges facing humanity in the 21st century. They're global in nature. They're things like climate change, ever-decreasing biodiversity, full use of the fresh water on the planet. But underpinning them in many ways is overpopulation. So unless we have a world which is basically peaceful, we'll never get the levels of trust, cooperation, or inclusiveness necessary to solve these problems. Therefore, peace is a prerequisite for the survival of society as we know it in the 21st century. And that is different than any other epoch in human history. In the past, peace may have been the domain of the altruistic, but in the 21st century, it's literally in everyone's self-interest. So that brings us back to the concept of measuring peace. And so peace is a relative term. It's relative to how you want to use it. So quite often the definitions of peace is just the absence of war. It's when the guns fall silent. And historically, that's pretty much how it's been used. But in the East, there are other concepts of peace, and that's inner peace, like it's equanimity. It's the lack of afflictive emotions. So you've got peace which can deal with inner peace. Now, the Institute for Economics and Peace uses two definitions of peace. And so, in many ways, the definition of peace which you want is the one which gives you the most utilisation in whatever you want to achieve. So the first one we use is the absence of violence or fear of violence. And that's what the Global Peace Index is based on. And that's a pretty good definition because most people can agree with it. Now, what we do then is we measure that along 3 different domains. The first one is internal safety and security. And so that consists of things like, let's say, the level of violent crime, homicide rates, the level of state-sponsored terror on its citizens, the number of police, number of people incarcerated, and other such measures, terrorism, for example, availability of guns. So that's the first of the 3 domains. The second domain is militarisation, which is fairly self-evident. And the third one is ongoing conflict. So we bring these 3 together to create a holistic index. And now you can break them out by the domains because for different countries, they perform quite differently on the different domains. Now, that definition of peace, the absence of violence or fear of violence, is very good for telling you the state of peace. It does nothing about how to create peace, does it? So that comes back to the concept of positive peace, those attitudes, this is the definition here, those attitudes, institutions and structures which create or sustain peaceful societies. Now, this is where the work we do at IEP gets really unique. Is what we've got about 50,000 different data sets, indexes, attitudinal surveys done at the national level down here in Sydney. So we do a lot of mathematical modelling and statistical analysis to determine those qualities which are most associated with peaceful societies, and that is positive peace. So what we do then is we run some regression analysis and statistical analysis to take the ones which are most statistically significant and clump them into groups, okay? And it comes out as 8 different groups, if you like. And that then gives you a topology from which to work. You can now take that and put that back into another index. So now you've got the ability to be able to measure the underlying changes in countries in terms of the qualities which create peace, or whether they're moving away from it or towards it. Now, this all works systemically. That's the first thing. But the positive peace, when we do further analysis, we find the same qualities which create a peaceful society, the same qualities which create a whole lot of other things which we think are important, like higher per capita income. So countries which are improving in positive peace compared to countries which are deteriorating in positive peace, on average have 2% per annum higher GDP growth rates, performs better on measures of ecological sustainability, better on measures of well-being, happiness, better on measures of inclusion. So in many ways, positive peace describes an optimal environment in which human potential can flourish.
Steve, it sounds like a positive peace as a concept is very holistic, and I can say it's systemic in its core. And I think it's very important, based on what you are telling now, to adopt a systems thinking approach to peace building and development. And maybe you can give us a couple of examples of your own initiatives, pursuits, where some of the thinking caused unintended effects.
Sure, I'll try and give some. I'll give a. I think when you're thinking through systems, a lot of us think we understand systems, but in reality we don't. It's a very, very difficult concept to really, when you get into it, fully to wrap your heads around. We all understand that there's systems, there's biosystems, there's social systems, etc., etc., etc. But if we look at just the very structure of the way society is based, it really springs out of empiricism, which is the study of the physical world. And we made great strides in the study of physics, but it's based on the concept that you cause and effect, and the effect doesn't influence the cause. So, for example, so you throw a rock in the air, it always comes down at the same speed. And so empiricism is based on scientific results where you can have an experiment, which is repeatable, and you'll always get the same results. That way it becomes a fact and everyone knows it. And that's great for the study of the physical world, but when you get down to the biological world and human systems, because we're just an extension of biology, it works very, very different. So as the effect comes back and influences the cause. And so think of two political parties, if you like, always jostling. The first one makes a statement on climate change, let's say. The second one comes back, hears that, adjusts, it makes a statement coming back. The first party now comes back and adjusts its posture depending on the input from the first one. And so at a very, very basic level, it's different. Even if you just look at the university system, it's not designed to work systemically. It's even the health system. I'll talk a lot about holistic health, but again, it's not. Because what happens is you have the concept of specialisation. So in the university, let's say, you start off, you've got these departments, and then as time goes on, you get more and more departments, and they get divided into further and further. And it's all about sort of you break from the study of physics and empiricism, you break something down into smaller and smaller and smaller parts, you can understand it, put it back together again, and it's a whole, okay? But that's not a system. A system is more than the sums of its parts. So look at your body, think about your body. Then isn't your consciousness more than the sum of the parts? Just as a simple example. And societies operate in a very, very similar way. Now, just to ground it, okay, so we're talking now at a pretty abstract level. So you can use these concepts and apply them to the way a nation state operates, and that's originally how we designed it. But you can also take the concepts and apply it down into a simple community project. I'm going to give you an example of one. So in Uganda, we worked with the Rotary Club there, and they'd been running a literacy project into a school in a very, very poor area. Been at it for 2 years without much improvement in literacy. So one of the guys who was running this project had done a lot of work on our positive peace and the concepts and those 8 pillars and how to apply them to solving problems systemically. Because what you do is you take a project like this literacy project in a school, then you ask questions through these 8 lenses of positive peace. And then that gives you a holistic way of being able to tackle the system, which in this case was schooling and literacy, let's say. And so what happened is they sort of worked out a whole lot of different things. So it looked through the prism of corruption, and so all the things donated to the school had tags put on them. They developed an inventory. The inventory was checked every 3 months. Other things like a equitable distribution of resources. Noted a lot of the kids just couldn't afford pens, so they'd distribute some pens. But the two, like then free flow of information. So they got on the local radio station to talk about the schooling and the thing they were doing there to pull people into the school. Another example, but the two which made a real difference. The first was acceptance of the rights of others. And so it looked at the girls in the school, and a lot of them weren't coming in 4 days a month because they were menstruating. So they provided sanitary pads and built some separate latrines for them to use, and sort of that got them back in. It also sort of got them more interested in staying at school and helped improve their academic grades. The thing which made the biggest difference, which you'd never get at through just a literacy program, was good relationships with neighbours. So this school was built in a rural setting, and what was happening at lunchtime, the kids were going into the various gardens around there and stealing all the fruit. And if you can imagine, in a very, very poor environment, every apple, every orange really counts. And so what was happening is the kids were just hungry, okay? So what they did was they then planted some fruit trees in the yard, but then also provided porridge lunchtime for the kids. And remember, this only costs a couple of cents a kid. It doesn't cost much. Now, what happened is the attendance at the school went up 240%. Okay, we ended up massively crowded. And the grades were only 30% of the students were getting in the top 2 grades in the district. Now 60% of the kids were. So what happened? Providing the food gave the kids the nutritional stamina so the brains wouldn't get tired in the afternoons. They could just simply concentrate. And once people knew that the kids would get a get a meal at lunchtime, they were not more inclined to send the kids to school rather than force them to go out and forage to get their own food.
Yeah.
They hit the free flow of information, get on the radio station, you start to tell people about this, and bang, now you've got an influx. So that's an example of a simple project of how you can apply a systemic approach to solving a very, very simple problem.
Yeah, that's very inspirational example, actually, I think, for many of us to follow. Now getting maybe towards the more global picture, I know that you recently released the 15th edition of the Global Peace Index. Would you share key insights? What is the global state of peacefulness? Is there anything that surprised you? And actually, does it provide us with any outlook for the future?
Yeah, so I think when we look back on the last decade, we think the last decade's been pretty terrible in many ways. It has. But if we looked at it, 86 countries improved while 75 deteriorated. And so that's probably different than what most people would think. More countries improved. But the overall peacefulness actually fell by 2%. And what that shows is that it's a lot easier to fall in peace than it is to create peace. And we see that again and again and again. You can see as countries come out of conflict. It takes a long while to actually really build the peace back up. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing over the last 2 years is that what we've been seeing for the prior decade was globally, more countries were decreasing their expenditure on the military as a percentage of GDP. But that's actually reversed now in the last couple of years. And that's because a lot of the growing geopolitical tensions you can see, let's say, between Russia and a number of European countries. You can particularly see it in China and down in the Pacific and the Indo-China seas. So that's a big, so that I think that's something which is a trend, and it's probably going to continue. So that is an area for serious concern. Particularly sort of when we look over Asia in the freedom of navigation through the Pacific, because 40% of the world's goods which are shipped come along those lanes. So I think that was one thing. If you can see growing inequality in peace, the most peaceful countries keep on getting more peaceful, and the least peaceful countries getting less peaceful. So there'll be a few of the things which we see, which I think are probably interesting for most people and things they don't know.
And Steve, when it comes to the index, and particularly in light of the mounting ecological threats facing humanity, do you have any further insight on the climate change, or how does it fit into the index, or efforts of the countries to be, more peaceful?
Well, we do an ecological threat register. We released it last year, and we'll release another one this year. And so what we can see with that, and this really came as a surprise for me when we dug into it, is this relationship between ecological degradation and conflict. So if you're looking at the countries with the most ecological degradation, the ones facing the most possible ecological shocks, they're also amongst the least peaceful in the world. So when we're looking at these ecological shocks, the country which has got the most potential for ecological shocks, Afghanistan. We went back to 2019, the two countries with the most fighting which occurred over water were Iraq and Syria. And it just, again, drives home this conflict. And I think in many places, you've got this vicious cycle which goes on, which is back to sort of systems in a way. So your ecological resources get degraded, people then fight over them, and you'll see the same thing with economic resources too when they run down. People then fight over them, so they fight over them, that degrades them further. So you've got this vicious cycle going on. But also with this, you've also got large population growth going on in many parts of the world. So if we look at Sahel, for example, that's one of the most stretched places at the moment. it's got some of the largest population growth in the world. So you've got 12 countries in the world which will more than double their population in the next 30 years. And a lot of these are in the areas of the world which are already degraded and unsustainable, such as the Sahel. But coming back to the core work which you're all doing on climate change. So we've done some work with a group called the Lloyd's Register from London, and they funded a global survey on risk. So one of the questions they ask, and this is out of about 63 different questions, is do you see climate change as a risk to your country in the next 20 years? Now, the countries with the biggest populations and biggest pollutants are some of the ones with the lowest responses to thinking that it's an issue. And like particularly China. So you've only got about 23% of the people in China think that climate change is a risk. If you go to India, it's 34%. Now, we've got no hope of being able to beat climate change unless you can take these really big countries with large populations and which are polluting to be able to get them to turn their industries around. So I think that's, and we've got a long, long way to go. That was my lesson out of this. What was even more fascinating, this was fascinating, the 12 countries, the 15 countries which rated as the highest priority, see it as the most risk, are 12 of them either speak Portuguese or Spanish. The one at the top of the list at 89% is Chile. Spain is also highly up there as well. So that's quite surprising. So if you come around to countries like, let's say, the US or Australia, it's about 50% of the population only. See it as an existential risk in the next 20 years. And that's about where the global average is at. So for me, in a lot of ways, there's a lot more work to do just in being able to get people's consciousness to arrive at the risks.
Yeah, indeed. I think it's human perspectives and the cultural heritage that sometimes drive the different appreciation by different nations of the relevance of certain risks and how do they feel about, living in a country or their overall well-being that at the end of the day is contributing to the feeling of the peacefulness. Maybe changing gears a little bit, we are truly delighted that you have accepted our invitation to become the founding fellow of Clean Growth Leadership Network. And in your book, you quite rightly state that the climate change can only be addressed by the world working in unison for the common benefit. And as you know, CGLN exists to provide a platform for academics and scientific innovators to connect with business leaders, financiers, and policymakers to generate solutions that tackle the climate emergency while growing our economy exactly for the well-being and peacefulness for all of the countries. So what do you feel the role of networks such as CGLN will be playing in solving the climate crisis or any other global crisis for that matter?
Look, I think networks like yours is absolutely crucial. And I think a lot of the time when you're looking at the multilateral system talks to the multilateral system. It doesn't engage with a lot of others. And so things like COP26 are good, and very, very good. But you also need organisations like yourself, particularly which can bring business leaders and bring them in and combine them with a lot of scientists. So for me, basically being an entrepreneur, I honestly think a lot of the issues with climate change can be solved through the combination of innovative technology and innovative business skills. Because really, if you can get the cost of being able to provide clean energy down, it's a no-brainer compared to polluting industries like oil or coal, then you've got the whole economics of driving it. Also, I think as you move forward, you're going to have the ability to sort of be able to sort of get a lot more resilience in the way we go about producing power as well. So if you look at the moment, you've got these huge networks, a lot of them fired by your thermal coal-powered fire stations, for example, or gas. So these are really big things. As you start to move to more and more solar generation, for example, you can now start, and we get better and better battery technology, you can now have every household feeding into the grid. Not only that, you've got battery backup and you put it in locally, now you've got a much more resilient type of structure compared to the old things where you've got a couple of massive cables running out of power stations. They go down, half a city goes out. So I think that there's just lots and lots of areas, but I think really sort of there's all sorts of innovative ways of being able to generate the electricity as well, just using biomass, for example. So I think just this combination of technology and industry, bringing them together, like that's be the fruit and the creation, the creative gist, if you like, to really solve our problems. Because I think business combined with those, as I said, those scientific skills is key.
Yeah, that's precisely our ethos of connecting the dots between different stakeholders of the clean growth, just to make sure that the brilliant ideas of academics and researchers and innovators are being implemented. You know, maybe to wrap up on our conversation today, as a founder of an institute dedicated to analyzing the factors that create and sustain peace, what is the question you are asked most often? And what is the one key takeaway or piece of wisdom you would like us to remember on the International Peace Day?
It's hard to come up with one question. Like I get a lot of questions, let's say, around the methodology, a lot of questions around the things on peace. Some people might say, well, isn't the military a force for good? Doesn't the military actually maintain the peace? And there's a partial answer to that, which is in some circumstances, yes. Okay, it's true. We can't do away with the military. We do need them. But it comes back to the concept of the absence of violence or fear of violence. Why do you have a military? One, it's because you fear for your safety. You need a military to defend, which is absolutely vital. Or you're going to use the military to do peacekeeping operations in violent parts of the world. But again, that comes back and says you need a military. Or you're going to use the military to improve your geopolitical position. And so in any way you look at it, it comes back to absence of violence or fear of violence. But on one note, we do a lot of work on the economics. The Institute for Economics and Peace says it all. So the cost of violence, the global economy in 2020 was nearly $15 trillion. That's 10.4% of global GDP. That's a lot of money. So if you just get 10%, so just 1% of that is the equivalent of all the overseas developmental aid spent in 2020. 10% reduction, and all of us can imagine a world 10% more peaceful. That's within our capabilities, clearly. That would be like adding 3 new economies to the world, the size of Switzerland, Denmark, and Ireland, just to put it in perspective. So what would be the thing which I'd really like to leave everyone on World Peace Day? And it's simply that peace isn't some utopian concept which is idealistic and good. It's practical, it's achievable, and small reductions in it result in a lot of improvements in well-being and the economies in which we live. The very things which create peace also create for a thriving economic environment. And for business, that's a really important lesson to understand. It's just not a small difference. It's not on the edges. We're talking about 200% higher GDP growth for the countries which are highly peaceful compared to the countries which aren't.
Well, thank you, Steve. Striking examples, striking statistics, and actually shocking statistics, I think sets the right tone for us to all strive for a better future and a more peaceful future. So thank you very much for finding time to talk to us today on the International Peace Day, and we hope to stay in touch. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Okay, great. Thank you, Yulia. Enjoyed the conversation.